Happy Friday and welcome to FluteTube. Today we're going to talk about trills. There have been a couple of other episodes where I talked about trills. One was called Trill, Tricks, and Traps, and one was a trill key rule, just a very quick, simple rule about using your trill keys. In Trill, Tricks, and Traps, I talked about one trap, which is that when we start to trill, we tend to stop counting as well. We get so distracted by our fingers moving fast while we trill that we kind of stop counting reliably. And this is something that obviously does not only happen to flutists, but all musicians. The first step is to be aware of it, know that it can happen, but the second thing we want to do is to take measures to not allow that to happen. So the question is, how can you practice your trills in a disciplined way that will help you keep track of how long they've been and not stop counting and come out of the trill right? One way that we can counteract the tendency to get a little bit sloppy with the counting in our trills is to actually measure the trills and know exactly how many notes we're going to put in them. I was first told to do this as a kid when I was learning a Mozart piano concerto. My piano teacher, who was very accomplished, a very skillful teacher, and knew what he was talking about, asked me if I knew how many notes were in a trill I was playing. It was a long trill, probably a whole note trill, and I remember feeling a little blown away. Like, who would know that? Who would know exactly how many notes are in a trill that they're playing? How could you keep track of so many notes? There are so many notes in a trill. But he introduced me to the idea, and he sold me on the idea that we can do a lot better with our trills when we know exactly how many notes are in them, how we're going to measure them, and keep the meter going around them. I would say, in general, the shorter note value your trill is, the more important it is to know exactly how many notes are going to be in that trill. For instance, in the Mozart D major flute concerto, we have a recurring idea, a lot of short trills, dotted eighth note trills, and because they're so short, if we don't play them all exactly the same, they are going to sound much more ragged, much less polished than if we know exactly how many notes are going to be in each of those trills and we keep it constant. I happen to know when I play those trills in the Mozart concerto, because of my choice of tempo and because of my choice to start each trill on the upper note, I end up playing 6 notes in each dotted eighth note trill. I absolutely do plan out exactly how many notes are going to be in each trill. I should point out, however, that in this case, Mozart has written in a trill termination for us. He's written in what we can call here a NACHSCHLAG. So we play 6 notes of a trill in my case, and then I add 2 more notes, which means each of these trill gestures is going to work out to be 8 notes for me. NACHSCHLAG, plural, are not always notated, but in this case, Mozart does notate them all. So we know that these trills should have that 2-note NACHSCHLAG at the end. And if you're feeling confused about what a NACHSCHLAG is, I can't really blame you. It's a term that can refer to a few different things, so it can be a bit of a confusing term. But in this case, I like this definition, which applies. NACHSCHLAG, singular, NACHSCHLAG, plural, in German, it literally means after beat. Nach is after, Schlag is beat. And in this case, it's the 2 notes that sometimes terminate a trill, and which, when taken in combination with the last notes of the trill, may form a turn. So, to demonstrate, if you're playing a trill and you end it with a 2-note NACHSCHLAG, there is embedded within that trill a turn. This is what a turn sounds like. If we play a slow trill and you listen for it, you hear that there is a turn embedded at the end of the trill. It's typically assumed that when you play a NACHSCHLAG at the end of a trill, the 2 notes that make up that NACHSCHLAG are going to be the same speed as the trill. You also don't want to pause or stop the trill before you play the NACHSCHLAG. You want the trill to go straight into the NACHSCHLAG as though that NACHSCHLAG is just a continuation of the trill. Now when I say you don't want to pause or stop the trill, I'm trying to embed subconscious messages because even though you don't want to do it, Everyone seems to want to do it. You don't want to stop the trill. Trust me, you don't want to stop the trill. While we're talking about practicing trills and gaining discipline in your trills, there are many other things that you can think about in terms of how do you want to polish your trills, how do you want to make them really disciplined when you play. Let's call these more advanced ways to add discipline to your trill. For instance, one that's used quite often, especially in Mozart trills, but it works in other styles of trills as well, is to start the trill more slowly and speed it up. This works really well to add interest and energy to the trill, and it can be quite a nice musical effect. If you're not used to working on trills with a lot of discipline like this, it can feel a bit daunting, I know. It can feel like, well, the trill is just supposed to be spontaneous and just fill in the time that you have. But the danger is we tend to try to just tack on one more trill. We don't want to stop our fingers, and so the trill ends up getting too long and throwing off our meter. Ultimately, we want to know what our technique goals are, and we want to be in command of our technique. We don't want to be kind of held hostage by what our fingers trilling want to do, or what our vibrato or our tongue want to do. We want to be the boss of them. So we've talked a lot about trills. Now the big question is, how do you develop this kind of discipline when you're practicing your trills so that when you perform them, they sound very polished and they don't get the better of you? And this is where our Flute Player's Bible comes in to help us once again. Taffanel and Gaubert, 17 big daily exercises. This is our Flute Player's Bible. And if you look at exercise number 17, the very last one in the book, you'll see an exercise that calls itself On the Trill. And by the way, this whole book is in the public domain. As usual, I will put an IMSLP link in the video description so you can go and get a free copy of this entire book if you want. Aren't you glad I would do something like that for you? You know, there's something that you could do for me in return. Then we'd kind of be even with exchanging nice things that we do for each other. Looking at exercise number 17, you'll see right away that it addresses a lot of the things I've been talking about today. It's a very straightforward exercise. It's measured trills. So you don't just sort of approximate how many notes you play. You want to play this exercise exactly as it's written and put the right number of notes in each trill. You add the 2-note NACHSCHLAG at the end, and it's in time, the same rhythm as the trill has been. As with all technical exercises, certainly the ones in this book, but really all the ones that you do, you should have really solid, defined goals for yourself. So I'm going to tell you some of the most typical goals that I have for this exercise, both for my students and for myself as we play through it, so that it's not just, oh yes, I did it, but that you're really working on improving something. First of all, do carefully measure and count each trill. Don't add or subtract notes from what's written in the book. Then, keep the NACHSCHLAG at the end of each trill in exactly the same tempo as the trill. Get used to thinking of it as a continuation of the trill that leads to a terminating note. The third thing is fingering. What kind of fingering are you going to use? I like to practice this with both real fingerings and also the trill fingerings. The normal fingerings are usually a little bit more demanding. It's harder to keep everything even and smooth, so I like to give myself that challenge. But then I also know that when I'm actually trilling, I will need to use a trill fingering. So of course I also practice with the trill fingering. Next thing, number 4, we cannot as flutists ever get away from this. We never should. You need to have a tone goal. It's never exclusively about fingers. I have experienced hearing someone who has a beautiful sound and messy technique. I can almost forgive the messy technique because I want to just listen to that sound. Have tone goals while you play. Usually I'm looking for a clear, resonant, straight tone, which is to say I'm not using any vibrato, I'm not messing with my airstream, I'm just keeping the tone very consistent through all that finger motion. Get the best possible sound you can for both notes and the NACHSCHLAG. Very consistent tone between those notes. You don't want one note to sound better than the other. You want them to be consistent and equal. Then I will likely have additional goals, like I may want to practice with an edgy tone or a round sound or a dark, rich sound. Number 5, Because for trills, there's going to be a lot of finger motion going on, hold your flute. I did a couple of videos on the topic of how to hold your flute. It sounds so basic, but if you go back and examine what you're really doing, you can make a lot of improvement. I'll put links to those. One is called Flute Balance, How to Hold Your Flute, and the other is Advanced Flute Balance. Feel free to develop your own goals here. It's not like these are the only acceptable ones, but you need to have specific goals that you're working towards so that you're really evolving. Keep in mind, as you practice your trills, we flutists are quite lucky to have facile technique. We are so often asked to play the fast, virtuosic, fun parts in the orchestra because we can do it very well. Of course, we need to practice to get to that point, and we shouldn't take it for granted that our fingers will just cooperate with us. But all of this means that you will be asked to play a lot of trills as a flutist. Invest the time working on TNG number 17. Get going faster and faster. Keep everything completely disciplined. It will be time well spent. And I mean, it's just one more way that you can make everyone around you wish that they too could play the flute. Because of course that is the goal here at FluteTube, is to take over the entire world with flute. Happy trill practicing!